Where are you right now? Lying in bed scrolling through your phone? Sitting at your desk with coffee getting cold? Maybe you're walking, driving, cleaning, just letting your mind wander while your hands stay busy? Perfect. You're exactly where you need to be, because tonight we're going somewhere most documentaries never dare to venture. Not to the painted caves or the stone circles or the gleaming spear points that fill museum cases. We're going deeper into the invisible battlefield that raged inside every human body for tens of thousands of years before anyone knew what a germ was. This is Sleepless Homo Sapien, where we tell the slow, quiet stories that shaped us long before we had words to describe them. If you're here for explosions and conquests, you might want to find something else. But if you're curious about the hidden war that our ancestors fought every single day, the war they couldn't see or name, but somehow survived long enough for you to exist, then settle in. Dim the lights if you want. Let the modern world fade just a little, because we're about to step into a time when your immune system was your greatest weapon, and most battles were lost before anyone even knew they'd begun. This is the story of disease in the Stone Age, and if you find these deep dives into forgotten human struggles helpful, whether you use them to fall asleep, focus during work, or just think differently about where we came from, a like and subscribe helps more curious minds discover this quiet corner of the internet. No pressure, no algorithm panic, just a small way to say these stories matter. Now let's begin. Picture this. It's 15,000 years ago. You wake up in what we now call southern France, but back then it was just the world, unnamed and unmapped. The fire beside your shelter has burned down to embers. Your breath makes small clouds in the cold air. Your daughter, maybe 4 years old, is coughing. It started yesterday. Just a little tickle. Now it's deeper, wetter. Her forehead feels warm against your palm. You don't know what bacteria are. You've never heard the word virus. You have no concept of contagion, no understanding of how invisible enemies can leap from person to person, like sparks from a fire. All you know is that sometimes people get sick, and sometimes they don't get better. Sometimes the strongest hunter in your band will wake up weak and be dead before the next new moon. Sometimes a child who was laughing and running yesterday will be still and cold by morning. This was the reality for our ancestors. They lived in a world absolutely teeming with microscopic predators they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight directly, and yet somehow, against odds that should have wiped them out completely, they survived. Not just survived, they thrived enough to spread across every continent, to paint caves and carve bone flutes and tell stories around fires and eventually become us. How? How did people, with no knowledge of germs, no antibiotics, no hospitals, no concept of hygiene beyond what felt right, manage to navigate a microbial landscape so deadly that it makes modern pandemics look like minor inconveniences? The answer isn't just fascinating, it's the reason you're alive to hear it. The invisible war began the moment our ancestors started living differently. For millions of years, early hominins lived in small scattered groups, rarely staying in one place long enough for waste to accumulate, or diseases to establish permanent footholds. They were nomadic, mobile, and most importantly, they were sparse. Pathogens need density to thrive. They need crowds, close contact, the kind of sustained transmission chains that only happen when lots of people live near each other for extended periods. But then something shifted. Around 20,000 years ago, some human groups began staying put longer. They started building more permanent shelters, creating seasonal camps they'd return to year after year. They began domesticating animals, bringing wild creatures into close, daily contact with human families. They started storing food, creating the surplus that would eventually lead to agriculture. And with every one of these seemingly positive changes, they opened new fronts in a war they didn't know they were fighting. The archaeological evidence paints a picture, both subtle and devastating. In hunter-gatherer burial sites from before this transition, skeletal remains show relatively few signs of infectious disease. Bones are generally robust, teeth are strong. Growth patterns suggest adequate nutrition. These people face dangers, certainly. Accidents, predators, the occasional violent encounter with neighbouring groups. But their skeletons don't scream of the kind of systemic, repeated assault on human health that would come later. Then as settlements become more permanent and populations more dense, something changes in the bone record. We start seeing more signs of chronic infection, more evidence of childhood diseases that stunted growth, more skeletal markers of immune systems under constant siege. The transition isn't dramatic at first, it's subtle, statistical, the kind of change you only notice when you look at hundreds of skeletons across thousands of years. But it's there, written in calcium and phosphate, recorded in the very architecture of ancient bodies. What was happening? The answer lies in understanding how diseases actually work, how they spread, how they establish themselves in populations. Most infectious diseases are opportunistic. They're like fires waiting for the right conditions to ignite and spread. Too few people, and the pathogen burns out quickly, unable to find new hosts before its current victims either recover or die. Too much distance between groups, and diseases remain localized, contained by geography and isolation. But give a pathogen the right conditions, dense populations, close living quarters, poor sanitation, regular contact between groups, and suddenly what was once a minor threat becomes an existential crisis. This is exactly what began happening as human societies grew more complex, more settled, more interconnected. The first battleground was probably waste, hunter-gatherer groups that more frequently left their refuse behind, literally walking away from their own contamination. But settled groups had to live with their waste, and waste is a breeding ground for pathogens, contaminated water sources, accumulated garbage, human and animal excrement in close proximity to living spaces. These created perfect conditions for gastrointestinal diseases, parasitic infections, and bacterial contamination. We can see evidence of this in the archaeological record through something called coprolites, fossilized feces that preserve microscopic evidence of what our ancestors were dealing with. Stone Age coprolites from more settled sites show higher concentrations of parasitic worms, bacterial infections, and other microscopic invaders than those from fully nomadic groups. The settled lifestyle, even in its earliest forms, came with a microbial price, but waste was just the beginning. The real game changer was animals. For most of human evolution, our relationship with other species was straightforward. We hunted them. We avoided them. We occasionally competed with them for resources, but we didn't live with them. We didn't share our sleeping spaces, our food sources, our daily routines. Domestication changed everything. When humans began keeping dogs, goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs in close proximity, they unknowingly created bridges for diseases to jump between species. Most of the infectious diseases that have plagued human civilization for the past 10,000 years originally came from animals. Smallpox from cattle, influenza from pigs and birds, plague from rodents, tuberculosis from cattle, measles from cattle or dogs. The list goes on and on. Our Stone Age ancestors were the first humans to cross these dangerous thresholds, to live intimately with animals in ways their predecessors never had. And they paid for it in ways both visible and invisible. The visible costs show up in skeletal remains, evidence of chronic infections, stunted growth, shortened lifespans. The invisible costs are harder to measure, but equally real. The constant background stress of immune systems working over time. The energy diverted from growth and reproduction to fighting off microscopic invaders. And yet, paradoxically, this invisible war may have been one of the most important evolutionary pressures our species ever faced. Because the humans who survived weren't just lucky, they were selected. Their immune systems, their genetic resistance to common pathogens, their behavioural adaptations to living in disease-rich environments, all of these traits were tested and refined by millennia of microscopic combat. The result was a species uniquely equipped to handle infectious disease, at least compared to our pre-agricultural ancestors. We developed complex immune systems capable of remembering pathogens and mounting faster responses on re-exposure. We evolved behavioural instincts around cleanliness, food preparation, and social distancing during illness that helped limit disease transmission, even without understanding the underlying mechanisms. Most importantly, we developed cultural practices, rituals around death and illness, traditions of caring for the sick, methods of food storage and preparation that reduced disease risk. These weren't based on scientific understanding. They were based on what worked, what kept more people alive, what communities that practiced them were more likely to survive and pass on their knowledge. The invisible war shaped us in ways we're still discovering. Recent genetic studies show that many of the immune system variants that help modern humans fight off infections were selected for during this crucial period when our ancestors first began living in permanent settlements with domesticated animals. The diseases that nearly destroyed them also gave them, and us, the tools to survive in a microbially dangerous world. But this is just the beginning of the story, because as human settlements grew larger and more complex, as trade networks developed and populations became more mobile, the invisible war intensified. New diseases emerged, old ones found new ways to spread, and human societies had to develop increasingly sophisticated strategies to survive in a world where the greatest threats were too small to see. What happened next would determine not just who lived and who died, but how human civilization itself would develop. The invisible war was about to become visible, written not just in bones and genes, but in the rise and fall of entire cultures, and our ancestors, armed with nothing but observation, trial and error, and a stubborn refusal to give up, were about to fight the most important battles in human history. The war they couldn't see was shaping everything they could. The most dangerous predator our ancestors ever faced wasn't the cave bear or the saber-toothed cat. It was something far smaller, far more patient, and infinitely more deadly. Something that could hide in a drop of water, in a breath of air, in the warm touch between mother and child. The deadliest hunter in the Stone Age was invisible, and it was already inside the camp. Let's follow that invisible threat as it moved through a typical Paleolithic band. Picture a group of maybe 30 people, 3 families loosely related, following the seasonal migration of reindeer across what we now call northern Spain. It's 12,000 years ago. The ice is retreating, the world is warming, and life should be getting easier. But easier for humans means easier for everything else too, including the microscopic passengers that travel with them, patient and persistent as shadows. The first victim is always the most vulnerable, an infant, maybe 6 months old, whose immune system is still learning to recognise friend from foe. The child develops what we might call a fever, but to his mother, it's just a dangerous heat that won't break. She tries everything she knows: cool water on the forehead, certain leaves that the older women say help with sickness. She holds him close, skin to skin, trying to share her strength. She doesn't realise that her loving touch might be spreading the very thing that's killing him. Within days, the fever moves through the band like smoke through dry grass. The elderly feel it first, their weathered immune systems overwhelmed by something their bodies have never encountered before. Then the children. The adults hold out longer, but even they begin to weaken. What started as a single case becomes a crisis that threatens the survival of the entire group. This scene played out thousands of times across the Stone Age world. We know because we can read it in the bones, in the patterns of death and survival that tell stories no oral tradition ever preserved. Archaeological sites from this period sometimes reveal what researchers call catastrophic mortality events. Multiple burials clustered in time, ages skewing toward the very young and very old, the telltale signature of epidemic disease sweeping through small populations. But here's what's remarkable. Most of these groups didn't disappear entirely. Somehow some survived. The question is how? How did people with no understanding of contagion, no concept of quarantine, no knowledge of hygiene beyond what seemed practical, manage to develop strategies that kept them alive in a world trying to kill them? The answer lies in something we might call evolutionary wisdom. Not conscious knowledge, but the accumulated instincts and behaviours that emerged because the groups that practiced them were more likely to survive. These weren't planned strategies. They were the cultural equivalent of immune responses, developing slowly, unconsciously, through trial and error across countless generations. Take isolation behaviour. Modern humans have an instinctive response to illness that goes far deeper than rational thought. When we feel sick, we tend to withdraw, to seek quiet spaces, to avoid social contact. We assume this is just about feeling bad, about wanting to rest. But researchers now think this withdrawal response may be one of our oldest and most important survival mechanisms. Stone Age peoples seem to have developed elaborate versions of this instinct. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many hunter-gatherer societies, the sick were moved to separate shelters, cared for by specific individuals who took on the risk of exposure. These weren't hospitals in any modern sense, but they served the same basic function. They isolated the sick and limited the spread of disease through the larger group. We see hints of this in the burial record. Sometimes individuals who died during what appear to be disease episodes are buried apart from the main cemetery areas, not abandoned, but separated, cared for in death as they were in life, but kept at a distance that might have helped protect the living. Even more sophisticated was the development of what we might call behavioural immunity. These were practices that reduced disease transmission without any understanding of germs or contagion. Food preparation rituals that involved cooking at high temperatures. Cleaning practices that removed contamination without knowing what contamination was. Social customs around touching, sharing, and proximity that minimized the spread of pathogens. Some of these practices survive in modern cultures as seemingly arbitrary taboos or traditions. The Jewish prohibition on mixing meat and dairy, for example, may have originated as a way to prevent food poisoning in an era before refrigeration. Islamic and Jewish restrictions on pork may reflect ancient recognition that these animals carried diseases dangerous to humans. Hindu concepts of ritual purity may preserve Stone Age intuitions about contamination and cleanliness. But the most important defense our ancestors developed wasn't behavioral at all. It was biological. The invisible war was fought not just between humans and pathogens, but between different versions of human genes. The individuals who survived epidemic diseases were those whose immune systems happened to be better equipped to fight them off. Their children inherited not just their tools and knowledge, but their genetic resistance to infection. This process, called pathogen-driven selection, may be one of the most powerful evolutionary forces our species has ever experienced. Diseases that killed most people in a population would spare those with certain genetic variants. Those survivors would have more children, and those children would carry the protective genes. Over hundreds of generations, human populations became increasingly resistant to the diseases that had once devastated them. We can see evidence of this process in modern human genetics. Many of the genes that control our immune responses show clear signs of having been under intense selective pressure in the recent evolutionary past. Variants that help fight off malaria, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases are more common in populations that historically face those threats. The genetic landscape of human immunity is literally a map of the diseases our ancestors survived. But this biological arms race came with costs. Strong immune responses that could fight off deadly infections were also more likely to attack the body's own tissues, leading to autoimmune diseases. Genetic variants that provided resistance to one pathogen might increase vulnerability to others. The immune systems that kept our ancestors alive were powerful, but they were also dangerous, prone to overreaction and friendly fire. Some researchers think this may explain why modern humans are so susceptible to allergies and autoimmune conditions. Our immune systems were forged in a world full of deadly pathogens, calibrated to respond aggressively to any potential threat. In the relatively pathogen-free environment of modern developed countries, these hair-trigger responses may be doing more harm than good, attacking harmless substances like pollen or food proteins as if they were mortal enemies. The invisible war also shaped human behaviour in subtler ways. The universal human emotions of disgust and fear may have evolved partly as pathogen avoidance mechanisms. We instinctively recoil from rotting meat, stagnant water, bodily fluids, and other potential sources of contamination. These emotional responses feel automatic, hardwired, because they are. They're the psychological residue of tens of thousands of years of pathogen pressure, behavioural immune responses that kept our ancestors alive. Even our social instincts may bear the marks of ancient disease pressures, the human tendency to be suspicious of strangers, to form tight-knit in-groups, to be wary of outsiders. These traits make sense in a world where contact with unfamiliar people often meant exposure to unfamiliar diseases. Xenophobia and ethnocentrism, ugly as they are in modern contexts, may have originated as crude but effective public health measures. The archaeological record suggests that Stone Age peoples did indeed treat strangers differently during times of illness. Trade networks that normally connected distant groups would shut down during epidemic episodes. Seasonal gatherings that brought together multiple bands would be cancelled or postponed. Without understanding disease transmission, our ancestors nevertheless developed practices that limited it. But perhaps the most profound impact of the invisible war was on human cooperation itself. Fighting disease required not just individual resistance, but collective action. Someone had to care for the sick, even at personal risk. Someone had to maintain the group's knowledge and traditions when the elders died. Someone had to make decisions about movement, resources, and contact with other groups when leadership was decimated by illness. The societies that survived were those that developed strong norms around mutual aid and collective responsibility. Archaeological evidence suggests that Stone Age groups invested enormous resources in caring for sick and disabled members. Skeletons from this period often show evidence of serious injuries or illnesses that would have required sustained care from others to survive. A broken leg that healed properly, a blind individual who lived to old age, a person with severe arthritis who was still buried with the tools of their trade. This wasn't altruism in the modern sense. It was evolutionary strategy. Groups that abandoned their sick members at the first sign of trouble were less likely to survive as coherent units. Those that developed strong caregiving traditions, that shared risk and resources even during crises, were more resilient in the face of both visible and invisible threats. The invisible war was teaching our ancestors one of the most important lessons in human history. Individual survival wasn't enough. In a world full of threats too small to see and too complex to understand, only collective action, shared knowledge, and mutual support could ensure long-term survival. The diseases that nearly destroyed them were also forging them into something new, something more cooperative, more resilient, more human. But the war was far from over. As human groups grew larger and more connected, as they began to domesticate plants and animals, as they started living in permanent settlements, the invisible enemies evolved too. New diseases emerged from the growing intimacy between humans and their livestock, old pathogens found new ways to spread through increasingly dense populations. The battlefront was about to shift in ways that would challenge every survival strategy our ancestors had developed. The next phase of the Invisible War would be fought not in small hunting bands scattered across empty landscapes, but in villages and towns where hundreds of people lived in close quarters, where waste accumulated faster than it could be cleaned, where domestic animals shared living space with human families. The stakes were about to get much higher and the enemies much more dangerous. Human civilization itself was about to become both a weapon and a battlefield in the war against invisible death. The moment humans began to cluster together in something resembling permanent settlements, they unknowingly triggered an arms race with enemies they couldn't see. It wasn't the large predators that would determine who lived and who died in this new world. It was the smallest ones. And as human communities grew from scattered bands of 30 to villages of hundreds, the invisible battlefield expanded in ways that would have terrified our ancestors if they could have comprehended what was coming. Around 10,000 years ago, in the fertile valleys of the Near East, something unprecedented was happening. Humans were staying put, not just for a season or two, but for generations. They were building houses that would outlast their builders, digging storage pits that would hold grain through multiple winters, creating the first permanent human settlements in history. And with every stone they laid, every foundation they dug, every wall they raised, they were changing the rules of the Invisible War. The pathogens that had once burned through small hunting bands and then died out for lack of new hosts suddenly found themselves in paradise. Dense populations living in close quarters, sharing water sources, breathing each other's air, handling each other's waste. For a virus or bacteria, these early villages were like finding an endless buffet after millennia of scraping by on occasional meals. The skeletal evidence from this period tells a story that would be tragic if it weren't also triumphant. Bones from Neolithic settlements show dramatically higher rates of infectious disease than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Childhood mortality spikes, growth stunting becomes common, dental abscesses, joint infections, and other signs of chronic illness appear in burial after burial. These people were paying a tremendous biological price for their new way of life, but they were also learning. Without understanding the microscopic mechanisms at work, early villagers began developing increasingly sophisticated responses to the disease pressures they faced. Archaeological evidence suggests they were experimenting with waste management systems, digging specialized pits for human refuse, creating drainage channels to direct contaminated water away from living areas. These weren't engineering marvels, but they were engineering, conscious, deliberate attempts to solve problems they could observe even if they couldn't understand their underlying causes. Food storage became a battleground in the Invisible War. Surplus grain, the foundation of settled life, was also a perfect breeding ground for rodents, insects, and the diseases they carried. Early farmers had to learn through bitter experience how to build storage containers that kept out moisture, pests, and contamination. They developed techniques for drying, smoking, and preserving foods that reduced the risk of spoilage and illness. They created elaborate rituals around food preparation and consumption that, while couched in religious or cultural terms, served essential public health functions. The introduction of domestic animals into human settlements created entirely new categories of health risk. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats didn't just provide meat, milk, and materials. They also provided diseases. Tuberculosis jumped from cattle to humans. Influenza evolved from pigs and birds. Anthrax spread from livestock to their human caretakers. For the first time in human history, people were living in daily intimate contact with other species, sharing sleeping spaces, food sources, and bodily fluids with creatures whose microbial passengers had never before had regular access to human hosts. The archaeological record from early farming communities shows clear evidence of zoonotic disease transmission. Human skeletons display lesions characteristic of tuberculosis, a disease that requires sustained close contact to spread effectively. Childhood remains show signs of infections that match known livestock diseases. Even more telling, the patterns of disease in human populations begin to mirror those seen in domestic animal herds, suggesting shared pathogen pools. Yet somehow, these early farming communities not only survived but thrived. Population densities that should have been unsustainable given the disease load continue to grow. Villages that should have been wiped out by repeated epidemics persisted for centuries. How? The answer lies in understanding that the invisible war was forcing rapid evolution on both sides. As disease pressure increased, human populations were undergoing intense natural selection. The individuals who survived to reproduce weren't just lucky. They carried genetic variants that provided some protection against the pathogens they faced. Their children inherited not just their parents' tools and knowledge, but their disease resistance. This process was accelerated by the increased population density itself. In small hunter-gatherer bands, a favourable mutation might take hundreds of generations to spread through the population. In dense farming communities, beneficial genes could proliferate much more quickly. The same conditions that made disease transmission more efficient also made genetic adaptation more rapid. We can see evidence of this accelerated evolution in the genetic makeup of modern populations. People whose ancestors lived in areas with high disease loads for thousands of years carry different immune system variants than those whose ancestors remained in low-density, nomadic societies. European populations, descended from some of the earliest farming communities, show genetic adaptations to tuberculosis, smallpox, and other crowd diseases. African populations that lived with malaria for millennia evolved sickle cell, anemia, and other protective mutations. Asian populations developed resistance to different pathogen suites based on their particular disease environments. But genetic adaptation wasn't the only response. Human communities were also evolving culturally, developing increasingly sophisticated behavioral defenses against invisible threats. Burial practices became more elaborate, not just out of religious sentiment, but as ways to safely dispose of potentially infectious corpses. Food taboos emerged that happened to reduce disease transmission. Social customs developed around cleanliness, contact with strangers, and behaviour during illness. Some of these cultural innovations were remarkably sophisticated. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Neolithic communities developed primitive quarantine systems, isolating sick individuals in separate structures at the edge of settlements. They created specialised burial grounds for those who died during disease outbreaks, suggesting recognition that some deaths were different from others, more dangerous to the living. Trade networks, which connected distant communities and allowed for the exchange of goods and ideas, also became vectors for disease transmission. But early traders seem to have developed customs that reduced these risks. Seasonal trading posts where goods could be exchanged without direct contact, ritual purification ceremonies before entering new communities, waiting periods between arrival and commerce that might have served as informal quarantine measures. The invisible war was also changing the physical structure of human settlements. Villages began to show evidence of planning that went beyond simple convenience. Houses were arranged to maximise airflow and minimise waste accumulation. Water sources were protected from contamination. Storage areas were designed to reduce pest infiltration. These weren't conscious public health measures, but they served that function. Perhaps most importantly, settled life was forcing humans to develop new forms of social organisation that could survive repeated population crashes. Disease outbreaks that killed 30, 40, or even 50% of a community's members required robust systems for maintaining essential knowledge and skills. Communities had to develop ways to ensure that critical information about farming, tool-making, food storage, and other survival skills could survive the loss of their most experienced practitioners. This led to the emergence of more formal teaching traditions, apprenticeship systems, and cultural institutions dedicated to preserving and transmitting knowledge. The same population density that made disease transmission more efficient also made knowledge transmission more reliable. A craft technique or farming practice that might be lost forever in a small nomadic band could survive in a larger settled community, even if its original practitioners died. The invisible war was literally shaping human civilization. The need to survive in disease-rich environments was driving innovations in engineering, social organization, food production, and cultural transmission that would become the foundations of complex society. The pathogens that threatened to destroy early farming communities were also forcing them to become more sophisticated, more resilient, more capable of supporting larger populations. But this evolutionary arms race was far from over. As human communities grew larger and more interconnected, as trade networks expanded and populations became more mobile, new diseases would emerge, and old ones would find new ways to spread. The invisible enemies were evolving too, becoming more virulent, more transmissible, more deadly. The stage was being set for confrontations between humans and pathogens that would make the early struggles of Neolithic villages seem like minor skirmishes. Plagues that would topple empires, epidemics that would reshape continents. The invisible war that began in small hunting camps was about to become a force that would influence the rise and fall of civilizations. And through it all, in ways both visible and invisible, the microscopic enemies that had stalked humanity since the beginning were continuing to shape what we would become. The war against invisible death was writing itself into our genes, our cultures, our very conception of what it meant to be human. Every breath we take, every social custom we follow, every instinctive response to illness and contamination carries the echo of battles fought by ancestors who never knew their enemies had names. The invisible war continues still, patient and persistent as ever, waiting in the spaces between us, in the air we share, in the food we eat, and the animals we live beside. Our ancestors gave us the tools to fight it, written in blood and bone, and the hard-won wisdom of 100,000 generations. Whether we use those tools wisely may determine not just our survival, but our humanity itself. The strangest thing about the invisible war wasn't how deadly it was how it made our ancestors kinder. You wouldn't expect microscopic predators to teach lessons about compassion, but that's exactly what happened. Because when death could come from a breath, a touch, a shared meal, the communities that survived weren't the ones that abandoned their sick. They were the ones that learned to care for them. And that caring, born out of necessity, in a world full of invisible threats, may have been one of the most important innovations in human history. Let me paint you a picture from about 8,000 years ago. A small farming village in what we now call Turkey. Maybe 60 people, living in mud brick houses clustered around a central courtyard. Barley growing in neat rows beyond the settlement walls. Sheep and goats penned nearby, their bleating mixing with the sound of children playing and women grinding grain. Then the fever comes. It starts with one child, then spreads to his family, then beyond. Within days, half the village is burning with temperatures that won't break. The elderly start dying first, then the youngest children. In a hunter-gatherer band, this would be catastrophic. The survivors would scatter, abandoning the sick, fleeing to safer ground. But these people can't flee. Their lives are rooted here, literally. Their grain stores, their animals, their investment in this place. They have nowhere to go. So they do something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They stay, they organise, they create what we might recognise as the first hospitals, the first systematic approaches to caring for the sick during epidemic disease. The archaeological evidence for this is subtle, but unmistakable. In settlements from this period, we find structures that seem purpose-built for isolation and care. Small buildings at the edges of villages, separated from main living areas, but still connected by pathways. Inside these structures, we find the remains of fires that burned continuously, evidence of food preparation, signs of long-term occupation by people who were likely too sick to care for themselves. These weren't death houses where the sick were abandoned to die. They were care facilities where the ill were tended by others who risked their own lives to provide comfort and treatment. We know because we find the bones of both patients and caregivers in these spaces. People who died together while fighting the same invisible enemies. But here's what's remarkable. The communities that developed these early healthcare systems weren't just more compassionate, they were more successful. Settlements that show archaeological evidence of systematic care for the sick also show evidence of longer occupation, larger populations, more complex material culture. Taking care of each other wasn't just morally admirable, it was evolutionarily advantageous. Why? Because epidemic diseases don't just kill people randomly. They create predictable patterns of mortality that can devastate the social structure of a community. The very young die because their immune systems aren't fully developed. The elderly die because theirs are worn out. But the people in between, the adults in their prime reproductive and productive years, they're the ones most likely to survive if given proper care. A community that abandoned its sick members during an epidemic might avoid some immediate risk of contagion, but it would also lose crucial knowledge and skills. The elderly who died alone might have been the only ones who remembered how to predict weather patterns, when to plant specific crops, how to navigate trade relationships with neighbouring groups. The children who died untended might have been the future of the community, the ones who would carry its traditions and innovations forward. But communities that organised systematic care, that risked infection to tend their sick members, preserved more of their human capital. They kept their knowledge holders alive longer. They maintained social bonds during crisis. They demonstrated to their own members that the community would not abandon them in their moment of greatest need, creating powerful incentives for loyalty and cooperation. The invisible war was teaching our ancestors that in a world full of unseen threats, individual survival strategies weren't enough. Only collective action, mutual aid, and shared risk could ensure long-term community survival. The diseases that threatened to tear apart the social fabric were also forcing humans to weave it more tightly. This shows up in the material record in fascinating ways. Burial practices from early farming communities become increasingly elaborate and standardized. People who died during disease outbreaks receive the same careful treatment as those who died of old age or accidents. Grave goods become more common, suggesting that even in death, community members retain their social identities and connections. More telling still are the signs of care for the chronically ill and disabled. Skeletons from Neolithic settlements sometimes show evidence of severe injuries or congenital conditions that would have required sustained support from others to survive. A person with a badly healed broken leg who lived for years afterward. Someone with severe arthritis who nevertheless continued to work and contribute to community life. These aren't isolated cases. They represent a systematic change in how human communities responded to vulnerability. The invisible war was also changing how knowledge moved between people. In small mobile hunter-gatherer groups, information could be lost forever if its holder died unexpectedly. But in larger settled communities, critical knowledge had to be distributed more widely, passed on to multiple people who could preserve it even if disease struck down the original experts. This led to the development of more formal teaching traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that craft specialization increased during this period, with specific individuals dedicating their lives to pottery, tool making, textile production, and other skilled trades. But these specialists weren't hoarding their knowledge. The consistency of techniques across sites and time periods suggests they were actively teaching others, creating redundancy that could survive epidemic mortality. The same principle applied to medical knowledge. As disease pressures increased, communities began developing more sophisticated understanding of illness and treatment. Not scientific understanding in the modern sense, but practical knowledge about which plants seem to help with fevers, how to care for the seriously ill, what to do with bodies after death to prevent further contagion. This knowledge was too important to be held by just one or two individuals. It had to be distributed, shared, embedded in community practices that could survive the loss of any single person. The invisible war was forcing our ancestors to become better teachers, more systematic in their approach to knowledge preservation and transmission. We can see this in the increasing standardization of material culture during this period. Pottery styles become more uniform within regions, suggesting shared teaching traditions. Tool-making techniques show less variation, indicating more systematic apprenticeship systems. Even architectural styles become more consistent, as if communities were following increasingly formal building traditions passed down through generations. But perhaps the most profound change was in human emotional and social development. The constant presence of invisible threats, the regular experience of epidemic disease, the need to care for sick and dying community members, all of this was shaping how people thought about relationships, responsibility, and meaning. Archaeological evidence suggests that ritual and ceremonial activity increased dramatically during this period. Not just burial rituals, but elaborate ceremonies around healing, purification, and community bonding. These weren't just religious practices. They were psychological technologies, ways of processing trauma, maintaining social cohesion, and finding meaning in the face of inexplicable suffering. The figurines and artistic objects from early farming communities often show scenes of caregiving, healing, and mutual support. Images of people tending to others, sharing food, participating in group activities. This wasn't just artistic preference, it reflected the increasing importance of these behaviours in daily life. The way epidemic disease was forcing human communities to become more cooperative, more interdependent. The invisible war was literally rewiring human social instincts. The communities that survived weren't the ones with the strongest individuals or the best weapons. They were the ones with the most robust systems of mutual aid, the most effective strategies for preserving knowledge through crisis, the strongest commitments to caring for vulnerable members. These behavioural changes were being reinforced by genetic evolution. Individuals who are naturally more inclined toward cooperation, more willing to take risks to help others, more capable of forming strong social bonds, were more likely to survive in communities under constant disease pressure. Their children inherited not just their genes, but their social tendencies, creating feedback loops that made human communities increasingly sophisticated in their responses to collective threats. The result was something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, a species that had evolved not just individual survival strategies, but collective ones. Communities that could maintain their knowledge, their social structures, and their cultural innovations even in the face of repeated catastrophic mortality events. The invisible war wasn't just killing our ancestors, it was teaching them to be human in ways they had never been before. The diseases that threatened to destroy early human communities were also forging them into something more resilient, more cooperative, more capable of surviving whatever invisible threats the future might hold. But the war was far from over. As human communities grew larger and more complex, as they developed trade networks that connected distant populations, as they began to domesticate new animals and crops, The invisible battlefield would expand in ways that would test every survival strategy they had developed. The next phase of the conflict would be fought not just between humans and pathogens, but between different human communities with different disease experiences, different genetic adaptations, different cultural responses to invisible threats. And when those communities met, when their separate evolutionary experiments collided, the results would reshape the entire human story. The caring that had emerged from necessity in small farming villages was about to be tested on a scale our ancestors could never have imagined. The invisible war that had taught them to tend their sick was about to teach them something even more challenging: how to remain human when the very act of contact with other humans could mean death. The most haunting moment in the invisible war came when two worlds collided, not continents crashing together in some geological catastrophe, but something far more subtle and infinitely more deadly. When communities that had spent thousands of years adapting to their own invisible enemies suddenly encountered communities with completely different microscopic passengers. These meetings, which should have been celebrations of human achievement, connections between distant peoples, often became apocalyptic events that could destroy entire civilizations in a matter of generations. Picture this scene, playing out countless times across the ancient world. A trading party approaches a distant village, carrying goods that have travelled hundreds of miles: obsidian from volcanic mountains, shells from distant seas, copper from remote valleys. They're welcomed with curiosity and celebration. Feasts are prepared, stories are shared. Children gather to stare at the strangers, with their exotic tools and unfamiliar accents, but hidden in that warm breath shared over evening fires, invisible in the touch of greeting hands, silent in the laughter that fills the night air, death is spreading. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just the inevitable consequence of two populations with different disease histories coming into contact for the first time. Within weeks, people who had never been seriously ill begin dying of fevers they have no name for. Within months, villages that had stood for centuries become ghost towns, their silent hearths slowly filling with wind-blown dust. This wasn't rare, this was the pattern. Every time human populations that had been separated for extended periods came back into contact, the invisible war intensified. The pathogens that had learned to coexist with one group found virgin territory in the other. Diseases that caused only mild illness in their original hosts became deadly plagues in new populations with no genetic or acquired resistance. The archaeological evidence for these collision events is written in the sudden appearance and disappearance of entire cultural traditions. Material cultures that flourished for centuries suddenly vanish from the record, replaced by completely different pottery styles, tool traditions, and settlement patterns. These aren't signs of conquest in the traditional sense. There are rarely signs of violence, no burned settlements, or mass graves filled with weapons. Instead, we see abandonment, emptiness, the quiet signature of populations simply ceasing to exist. But here's what makes this phase of the invisible war so complex. The communities that survived these encounters weren't just lucky. They were the ones that had developed the most sophisticated strategies for managing disease transmission between groups. They had learned, through bitter experience, how to make contact with strangers without triggering catastrophic epidemics. Some of these strategies are preserved in the ethnographic record of historical hunter-gatherer and early farming societies. Elaborate protocols for approaching unfamiliar groups, ritual waiting periods before full contact was established, ceremonial exchanges that allowed for gradual exposure to new pathogens rather than sudden overwhelming contact. These weren't consciously designed as public health measures, but they served that function, reducing the risk of catastrophic disease transmission. Trade networks from this period show evidence of these protective protocols. Archaeological sites reveal trading posts that seem designed to facilitate exchange while minimizing direct contact between different populations. Neutral territories, where goods could be left and retrieved without face-to-face meetings. Seasonal gathering places that allowed for controlled, limited interaction between groups that normally lived far apart. These buffer zones and controlled contact systems represent some of the most sophisticated responses to disease risk in the pre-scientific world. Without understanding pathogens or transmission mechanisms, our ancestors were developing practices that accomplished the same goals as modern quarantine and disease surveillance systems. They were learning to navigate the invisible war not just within their own communities, but between communities. The genetic evidence tells an even more complex story. Populations that survived repeated contact with diverse groups show signs of having maintained much more genetic diversity in their immune system genes than isolated populations. This wasn't accident, it was selection in action. The communities that could handle exposure to a wide range of pathogens were those with the broadest spectrum of genetic resistance mechanisms. But genetic diversity alone wasn't enough. The populations that thrived in this interconnected world were also those that developed the most flexible cultural responses to disease. They maintained larger communities that could absorb population losses. They developed more robust systems for preserving knowledge through demographic crashes. They created more sophisticated care systems that could keep higher percentages of their sick members alive. Most importantly, they learned to balance the benefits of connection with the risks of contagion. Complete isolation might protect a community from foreign diseases, but it would also cut them off from trade goods, new technologies, genetic diversity, and the cultural innovations that came from contact with other groups. The communities that succeeded were those that figured out how to maintain connections while managing the microbial risks those connections created. This balancing act shows up in the archaeological record in fascinating ways. Settlement patterns from this period often show communities positioned to take advantage of trade routes while maintaining some distance from them. Villages located near rivers or mountain passes that facilitated long-distance travel, but set back far enough to control who entered and when. Architecture that includes specialized areas for receiving and processing goods from outside sources, separate from main living areas. The invisible war was teaching our ancestors one of the most important lessons in human history. That survival in an interconnected world required not just individual or community-level strategies, but regional and even continental-level coordination. Disease didn't respect territorial boundaries or cultural differences. Pathogens that emerged in one community could spread across vast networks, threatening populations that had no direct contact with the original source. This realization led to the development of some of the first large-scale human institutions. Not governments in the modern sense, but networks of communication and cooperation that could coordinate responses to invisible threats across multiple communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that information about disease outbreaks was being shared between settlements hundreds of miles apart, allowing distant communities to prepare for or avoid potential contagion. Religious and ceremonial networks may have served this function, creating regular gatherings where information about health conditions could be shared along with ritual activities. Trade guilds and merchant associations certainly played this role in later periods, developing protocols for safe travel and commerce that took disease risks into account. Even marriage networks between communities may have evolved partly as ways of sharing immunity and disease resistance across populations. The invisible war was forcing our ancestors to think beyond their immediate communities, to consider their health and survival as connected to the health and survival of groups they might never directly encounter. A disease outbreak in a community hundreds of miles away, could threaten their own survival if it spread along trade routes or migration paths. Their own health decisions, their own responses to illness, could have consequences for distant populations they had never met. This interconnected thinking about invisible threats may have been one of the foundations of complex civilization itself. The need to coordinate responses to disease across multiple communities required the development of communication systems, leadership structures, and decision-making processes that could operate at scales much larger than individual settlements. The invisible war was teaching our ancestors to think and act collectively, not just within their own groups, but across entire regions. But this expanded scale of cooperation came with expanded risks. As trade networks grew larger and more complex, as populations became more mobile and interconnected, the potential for catastrophic pandemic events increased exponentially. A disease that might once have burned through a single community and died out could now spread across continents, following the very networks that had been created to enhance human cooperation and prosperity. The stage was being set for confrontations between humans and pathogens that would dwarf anything our ancestors had yet experienced. Plagues that would follow trade routes across Eurasia, decimating populations from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Epidemics that would arrive with explorers and conquerors, wiping out entire civilizations that had no resistance to foreign diseases. The invisible war that had begun in small hunting camps was about to become a global conflict that would reshape the demographic and cultural map of the entire planet. And yet, through it all, the lessons learned in those early encounters between distant communities would remain relevant. The strategies developed for managing disease transmission across cultural boundaries, the institutions created for coordinating responses to invisible threats, the recognition that individual and community health were inseparably connected to the health of larger human networks. These insights, born from necessity in a world full of unseen enemies, would become essential tools for survival in an increasingly interconnected world. The invisible war was teaching our ancestors that in a world where microscopic threats could travel faster than any human messenger, survival depended not just on fighting diseases, but on fighting them together. The pathogens that threatened to divide and destroy human communities were also forcing them to develop the cooperative strategies that would become the foundation of everything we now call civilization. But the war was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its most devastating phase. As human populations grew larger and denser, as agricultural systems became more intensive, as animals and humans lived in ever closer proximity, new diseases would emerge that would make all previous epidemics seem like minor skirmishes. The invisible enemies were evolving too, becoming more virulent, more transmissible, more deadly. The next chapter of the invisible war would be written not just in the bones of the dead, but in the rise and fall of empires, the movement of armies, the collapse of trade networks, and the reshaping of entire continents. The microscopic predators that had stalked humanity since its earliest days were about to prove that they were still the most dangerous enemies our species had ever faced. And in the end, the question that would determine the future of human civilization was not whether we could defeat these invisible enemies, but whether we could learn to live with them, to adapt to their presence, to build societies resilient enough to survive their periodic assaults. The invisible war that had shaped our biology, our behaviour, our very conception of what it meant to be human, was about to become the defining challenge of the civilized world. The ancestors who had learned to care for their sick, to coordinate responses across communities, to balance connection with protection, had given their descendants the tools they would need for the battles ahead. Whether those tools would be enough remained to be seen. The invisible war continued, patient and persistent as ever, waiting in the spaces between us, ready to test every assumption about human progress, every strategy for collective survival, Every hope that we had finally learned to master the microscopic world that had mastered us for so long. The war our ancestors couldn't see was about to become visible in ways that would change everything. And in the end, that war never really ended. It just changed theatres, changed tactics, learned to hide in new places. The microscopic predators that had stalked our ancestors through ice ages and farming revolutions, through the first villages and the first trade routes, they didn't disappear when we invented writing or built cities or discovered antibiotics. They adapted, they waited, they evolved alongside us, patient as stone, persistent as gravity. Right now, as you listen to this, billions of invisible passengers are travelling with you. In your gut, on your skin, in the air you breathe. Most of them are harmless, some are even helpful, but others are simply biding their time. The same bacterial lineages that killed Neolithic farmers are still with us, still probing for weaknesses in our defences. The viral families that swept through Stone Age camps are still circulating, still mutating, still searching for new ways to slip past our immune systems. The difference is that now we can see them. We can name them, track them, sometimes even predict their movements. But seeing the enemy doesn't always mean we can defeat it. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us, in the starkest possible terms, that we are still fighting the same invisible war our ancestors fought, still struggling with the same fundamental challenges. How do you balance connection with protection? How do you care for the vulnerable without endangering the healthy? How do you maintain social cohesion when contact itself becomes dangerous? The answers our Stone Age ancestors developed, slowly and painfully over tens of thousands of years, are still with us, written into our genes, embedded in our instincts, preserved in cultural practices we follow without thinking. The disgust response that makes you recoil from spoiled food. The social distancing that happens naturally when someone is visibly ill. The urge to wash your hands, to avoid crowds during disease outbreaks, to care for sick family members despite the risk to yourself. These aren't modern innovations. They're ancient wisdom, tested by millennia of invisible warfare, refined by countless generations of humans who survived long enough to pass them on. The same cooperative instincts that helped Neolithic communities organise care for their sick members drove the development of modern hospitals. The same long-distance communication networks that warned Stone Age settlements about approaching epidemics evolved into our global disease surveillance systems. But perhaps the most important lesson from the invisible war is also the most uncomfortable one. That progress isn't always progressive, that every advance in human civilization, every step toward greater complexity and connection, also creates new opportunities for our microscopic enemies. Agriculture gave us food security, but also zoonotic diseases. Cities gave us culture and commerce, but also epidemic transmission. Global trade networks give us prosperity and connection, but also pandemic risk. The invisible war taught our ancestors that survival isn't about defeating every threat, but about building resilience in the face of threats that can never be completely eliminated. They learned to live with uncertainty, to prepare for catastrophes they couldn't predict, to maintain hope in the face of invisible enemies they couldn't understand. And maybe that's the real gift they left us. Not just the genetic resistance to ancient diseases, not just the cultural practices that reduce transmission risk, but the deeper wisdom that comes from accepting our place in a world full of unseen forces beyond our control. The knowledge that individual survival depends on collective action. That caring for others is not just morally right, but evolutionarily essential. That the price of connection is vulnerability, but the cost of isolation is extinction. The bones in the ground tell us that our ancestors paid a terrible price for the lives we now live. Shorter lifespans, chronic illness, childhood mortality rates that would break our hearts. But they also tell us something else, that humans can adapt to almost anything, survive almost any catastrophe, find ways to maintain meaning and connection even in the face of incomprehensible loss. The invisible war is still being fought in laboratories and hospitals, in policy meetings and research papers, in the daily choices we make about how to live together safely in an interconnected world. The enemies have names now. We understand their mechanisms, their life cycles, their vulnerabilities, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do we remain human while fighting an inhuman threat? Our ancestors, those Stone Age survivors who learned to care for their sick and coordinate their responses and balance risk with connection, they didn't leave us a perfect world. They left us something more valuable, a species tough enough to survive the invisible war, wise enough to learn from it, and stubborn enough to keep fighting it, one generation at a time. So the next time you wash your hands, or avoid someone who's coughing, or stay home when you're feeling sick, or get a vaccination, or simply choose to help someone who's vulnerable, remember that you're carrying forward a tradition that stretches back to the very dawn of human civilization. You're a warrior in the same invisible war your ancestors fought, armed with better weapons, but facing the same fundamental challenge. The war they couldn't see shaped everything they became, and everything they became shaped everything we are. The battle continues, patient and persistent as ever, written in our DNA and whispered in our instincts, reminding us that we are still, and will always be, creatures forged in the crucible of invisible conflict. The Stone Age ended, but the war never did. It just taught us to fight smarter. And maybe, if we're very lucky and very wise, that will be enough.